Professor, what anticoagulant therapy after an acute coronary syndrome?
We have a long track of interest for anticoagulants after an acute coronary syndrome, after an acute myocardial infarction in practice. Studies dating already now roughly 20 years have shown that warfarin, the good old vitamin K antagonist, might be useful alone or in addition to aspirin for patients after myocardial infarction. These treatments, however, were never taken up by the cardiological community, essentially because of the excess bleeding that this therapy causes, which is much more substantial than with the addition of a second antiplatelet agent. However, in more recent time, the introduction of the non-vitamin K antagonist oral anticoagulants is opening new possibilities because these, let's call them new oral anticoagulants, are much more favorable from the bleeding profile than vitamin K antagonists, especially with regard to intracranial bleeding, to hemorrhagic stroke, which is one of the drawbacks of the Achilles heel of vitamin K antagonists. This dramatic consequence of anticoagulation is sharply reduced by the new oral anticoagulants, and therefore it was logical to test these drugs in addition to standard therapy. Now, standard therapy is still dual antiplatelet therapy in the first year after an acute coronary syndrome. So the first trial, which was the Atlas II trial, tested one of these drugs, rivaroxaban, on top of aspirin plus clopidogrel, showing that you can increase efficacy, but however, still causing bleeding, and this was the reason why this message did not get through guidelines, and still today dual antiplatelet therapy is considered the standard. In the meantime, there were, however, trials that were started and were dedicated, one to the first year after an acute coronary syndrome, trying to limit bleeding by dropping the aspirin component and introducing rivaroxaban instead of aspirin. This was the strategy tested in the Gemini trial that showed that rivaroxaban is as safe as aspirin, not showing, however, increased efficacy. The other trial that, however, had started much bigger in terms of numbers is a trial where the anticoagulant is given long-term after the first year after a myocardial infarction, and also in patients with peripheral arterial disease. And in this trial, there is one control arm which is aspirin alone, a second arm that is aspirin plus very low dose of rivaroxaban given twice daily, 2.5 milligram twice daily, and the third arm that uses rivaroxaban alone at 5 milligram per day. So against the aspirin, against the standard treatment. We still don't know which of the two rivaroxaban arms shows the best efficacy to benefit ratio, but we know that the trial has been stopped because of overwhelming efficacy. So we think that these treatments, at least one of these treatments, including rivaroxaban, might be the future strategy for long-term treatment. We still have to see the results that will be presented at the ESC Congress in Barcelona at the end of August.
So this is one of the main themes of this Congress. What are the other take-home messages?
There were many messages. The entire meeting was dedicated to atherothrombosis from the pathophysiological background, so the current classification of the vulnerable plaque, the current mechanisms that lead to acute coronary thrombosis, the mechanisms of inflammation that trigger an acute coronary syndrome and the acute coronary thrombosis. And then there were very broad overviews on techniques in order to address the residual cardiovascular risk. I want to mention, for example, the excellent lecture by Professor Lo Scalzo dealing with networks of phenotypes that can be derived by looking at markers of vascular disease that eventually may lead to the identification of new therapeutic targets and new strategies. And then we ended up with a review of the current situation with antiplatelet agents, including aspirin, with all the story of this glorious drug, to the P2Y12 inhibitors, including ticagrelor and prasugrel, including clopidogrel also, and then with the new anticoagulants and new biomarkers in vascular disease. So a comprehensive view of the entire team, starting from the pathophysiological background, with a translational outlook, and now to current therapies and future avenues for therapeutics.